Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits. And I've been wondering recently if that time in long ago history when the dinosaurs were wiped out might now be better known as T-Rexit, which has precisely nothing to do with anything. But this does my introduction to this week's episode of Musical Talk. Well, I'm sure you'll know by now that there is never a bad time to hear more from Michael Gordon Shapiro, the noted American composer and the man behind the award-winning show The Bully Problem, which we've covered previously here on Musical Talk and will continue to do. And don't forget there's an album coming out soon of that wonderful new show. But, as you'll also be aware, Mike is a great traveller of the world and often makes it to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, where he and I get to see shows together if we can possibly manage it. And we do possibly manage it, and indeed have. And the proof of that's going to be in the discussion you're about to hear, because today we'll be hearing a conversation I had with Mike at last summer's Edinburgh Festival Fringe, discussing two very, very different shows. The Grey Cat and the Flounder, and Jekyll Vs Hyde. Now, we've already heard from the writers of Jekyll Vs Hyde, that's Lawrence Owen and Lindsay Sharman, in a previous episode. But so adroit and excellent is their work that Mike and I both identified it as a show that we really wanted to talk about, and positively, when we met to discuss the things that we'd seen at Edinburgh. And that will be what starts our conversation together. But after that, you'll be hearing our conversation about a show called The Grey Cat and the Flounder, a show originally written in 2018 to celebrate the life of a couple who had been together for 46 years, and which had originated with the Pittsburgh New Music Ensemble. Now, the show itself is incredibly curious, by which I mean strange, particular, peculiar, all those words, and a show like no other. And it's not just because of the narrative. The main reason it's such an unusual show, and a show that we wanted to talk about here on Musical Talk, was because of its format. It was a show where, as you went in, each member of the audience was given a set of headphones, which meant that you were in a crowd and yet on your own, listening to the music and the performance as though you were listening to it on the radio at home, with a lot of very clever things done around a binaural microphone. And it was based, as I say, on a true story of a couple. It also included some musical settings of songs by Stephen Foster, the legendary American composer, who we've also featured here on Musical Talk. Well, I hope that whets your appetite for what's about to come. And if it hasn't, hopefully this will. We're going to hear two songs from Jekyll Vs Hyde, which sum up the strange dichotomy not just of the central character, stroke characters, spoilers, but also the way this magnificent musical was written. The first song is the Transformation song, and the second song is called Whoa, Whoa, Whoa. We've played them both on Musical Talk before, and they're well worth hearing again. And then afterwards, you'll hear that conversation I had with Mike Shapiro about Jekyll Vs Hyde and The Grey Cat and the Flounder.
Why is it good is praised and bad is shunned, when bad comes naturally to everyone? Why do we judge the evil that men do, when we ourselves have evil in us too? And is it really in God's plan that we make pains to quash the natural state of man? Well, not I will tolerate this fantasy no more. I will be freer than man's ever been before, free to explore the other side of humankind, which for so long has been mistrusted and maligned, and which feckless laws forbid. With just one draught, I shall ascend into a playground of the id. hardly bear to look upon your face. You're perfect. My friend, the things that I will do with you, or should I say the things you'll make me do? You think my thoughts, but do you speak my tongue? Quick, Jekyll, speak!
Cogito ergo sum.
A voice as ugly as a voice can be. I dared not hope for such depravity. I am invisible behind your face, this flesh and bone, the perfect hiding place. The perfect hiding place. But of course, you must be named, and for the service you provide, I shall call you Mr. Hyde.
Musical talk.
Picture the scene. The staff room of St. Bart's High School somewhere in America. Dr. Jekyll, head of chemistry, chats to his pals, gym teacher Mr. Utterson, and substitute physics teacher Victor Frankenstein.
Hey dudes, what's up? It's everyone's favorite chemistry teacher, Dr. Jekyll.
J-Man, bro, where you been? Checking out the cheerleaders at practice?
Whoa.
High five!
High five! That's your trick, you old dog. I've only got eyes for one little lady, Juicy Lucy Lanyon.
Oh yeah, you had a date with Dr. Lanyon last night. How did it go?
Oh, hey, Victor. Oh, what's that smell? Did you fart?
No, you splashed me with sulfur as a joke, remember?
Oh, yeah. Haha, that was pretty funny. Anyway, let me tell you about my date. Went to the Science Museum with my special lady. It's intellectual. They got a special exhibit on how you make babies. It's also sexual. I could tell by the sweat on her face that her heart was starting to race.
Whoa, 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 what next? J-Man, you're such a tease. Did she let you touch her biologies?
A gentleman never tells.
Oh, come on.
But a scientist explains.
Yeah.
Let me tell you a little thing about the laws of attraction. The human brain is especially reliant on odors to make connections. So I occasionally wafted my manly aromas in her direction. I could tell she was feeling the heat by the way she was grinding her teeth.
Whoa, 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 what next? You're teasing our prickles. When's your story gonna get physical?
I knew she was infatuated, 'cause when I spoke, her pupils dilated. And that's what happens when a lady feels arousal.
Or panic?
And hers were gigantic.
Whoa, 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 what's next? Did you do a chemistry? Did you zap her body with electricity?
Ugh, no, Victor. You don't even go here.
Oh, nobody likes a substitute teacher.
Oh, it's Lucy. Hey, Lucy. Ready for our big second date tonight? What do you mean a rain check? But I thought you liked... Hello? Hello? She broke up with me.
Oh, that's too bad.
Shut up, Victor. I can't believe this. Why do nice guys never get the girls?
Girls like bad boys, maybe you're kind of a square.
Shut up, Victor. Oh, maybe you're right. God, girls are so shallow. I try so hard to be nice and no one appreciates it. I bet if she knew I had a dark side, she'd really like me. You want a bad boy, Lanyon? I'll show you a bad boy. I'll figure out a way to unleash the monster inside. Then she'll go out with me, 'cause I'm bad. Who's bad? That's me. You got it. Ooh, I'm bad. Who's bad? I'm really bad. Yeah, I'm really, really bad. Fucking hell.
Well, Mike, here we are again to talk about yet more shows we saw at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2019. All of the shows we talk about are shows which I've either enjoyed tremendously or have enjoyed some aspects of.
There's been a really wide variety of shows, both in subject matter and, of course, in quality as well this year. But I've been really pleased overall, and of course, it's always fun to get together and kibitz about what we've seen.
A word I don't actually know, but I'm sure I agree with it.
Always happy to expand your vocabulary.
What was it again?
Kibitz.
And what does it mean?
Sort of chit-chat.
Oh, right, really? Do you know, I genuinely haven't come across that.
I'll double-check to make sure that's true, and if it's not, we'll edit this out. So if you're hearing this, it turned out that was true.
Everything you say is gospel as far as I'm concerned. But I think today we're going to talk about a show that we both admired very much by someone or some people that we admire very much, and that's Lawrence Owen and his wife Lindsay Sharman, who in recent years have been working together to put on shows. They did a very excellent Time Machine a couple of years ago, but have surpassed themselves, I think, this year with Jekyll Vs Hyde, which takes the Jekyll and Hyde material and... well, it is exactly as they say. It is, as we know, there is a duality in the Jekyll and Hyde story anyway. I don't think I'm breaching any spoilers here after 100 odd years, but in this case, we start with Lawrence Owen on stage trying to tell us a very serious reworking of the Jekyll and Hyde story called Strange Case, which is a kind of little chamber musical version of it. Although, obviously, because Lawrence and Lindsay are both very funny people, even this serious telling is done through, at least at the beginning, through sock puppets. The two gentlemen in their Victorian living room relating the story of Jekyll and Hyde and the setup exactly as it is in the book. Lindsay is supposed to be the technician on the stage. She's also playing Mrs. Twiglet, the much put upon housekeeper whose only role is to go off and collect cakes for the two sock puppets who are telling the story. She eventually rebels and says this is boring, and then goes on to say, but we've already written a much more lively, possibly raucous, vulgar and, dare I say it, commercial version for the brasher end of the West End and Broadway stage called Heidi Ho. And then we proceed to get a few songs from that, and it is both highly entertaining and terrible in its own different way. And then, of course, the rest of the piece is essentially an argument between the two actors on stage representing the two aspects of the musical, and then finding a middle way in the end, as it turns out, to tell the story in a way that works successfully whilst resolving their internal partnership relationship issues on the stage. But what you're actually getting, of course, is a tremendously clever gloss on the nature of duality and the Jekyll and Hyde, the good and the bad, stemming from the same source, both in source material and in person.
And yet I would argue...
playing out on stage. Marvellous, I think.
Sorry, I didn't mean to trot on you just there. But having done so, I will say that I also think that the show, if we were to ask ourselves, what is the show about? It's actually a show about parity in collaboration, creatively. Because the depiction of these two different contradictory versions of Jekyll and Hyde and the humorous juxtaposition of the two and the alternating back and forth, that's almost the battleground for recognition between the heightened quasi-fictionalized version of Lindsay and quasi-fictionalized version of Lawrence. At the start of the show, when Lawrence is introducing, what was it?
Strange Case.
He comes across both as a caricature of himself, but along a very specific axis. He's very full of himself as an author. And I think he says, music by I, Lawrence Owen. Lyrics by I, Lawrence Owen.
He does indeed.
And that's very funny, but it also sets up this tale of somebody who's very much sees himself as a solo artist when he's not. He has a collaborator. And obviously in real life, I don't expect there is this kind of contentiousness, but in the fictionalized version of the two of them, he is very much sweeping his partner, both domestic partner and creative partner, under the rug and giving her a bit part. And initially, Lindsay protests as the character, in the voice of the character, saying, this is a dumb role, I'm not getting enough to do. And eventually, she steps out of the character, and then the meta discussion begins about which version of Jekyll and Hyde they should do. And at the end of it all, they find a kind of collaborative equilibrium between the two of them. And I think that's the actual nugget of real message that is smuggled in this enjoyable, zany ride through dysfunctional personalities and ill-fated adaptations.
That is a very interesting extra parallel, and I agree with you, and I think I was absorbing that without necessarily clocking it overtly. I think I was, as always, taking the ridiculously pompous, overly intellectual approach of congratulating myself on having spotted the duality essay. But you're quite right, it is about a collaborative relationship in both senses of the word. I will just say that it also sits, or stands, I should say, head and shoulders above other representations of that particular problem. Now, I must say, having gone to the Fringe now for well over a decade, I have sat through more than my fair share of shows where people are not sufficiently comfortable with their material, but they feel they need to add an extra level, or the subplot is often an argument in real life, as it were, between the performers of a piece instead of any of the characters in the piece. I've even seen it in a Gilbert and Sullivan concert, which some very accomplished American singers put on a few years ago, but then completely ruined by concocting a kind of mock faux rivalry between the principal tenor and the principal soprano. As you know, a failed relationship was alleged to have occurred, and now they were singing reluctantly with each other. And I've seen variants on that so often as a way of spicing up an otherwise unconvincing narrative, to use Gilbert. But in this case, it was built in deliberately. And therefore, what it didn't feel like was an adjunct. It didn't feel like, oh no, this doesn't quite work, let's A, send it up, or B, add this kind of exoskeleton subplot, and be meta about it as well, because that's very fashionable. It was built this way. It was designed for this relationship to be the central relationship in the story, more so than the Jekyll and Hyde story. And as a result, I think was seamless in the way that it executed that back and forth between the telling of the Jekyll and Hyde story through two variant different ways of doing it, and the Lindsay and Lawrence story. So what it felt like to me was a fully integrated, seamless production and performance, or performances, and not just a bolt-on.
One thing I like about chatting with you is hearing my own opinion expressed far more eloquently than ever I could do myself.
You're very flattering, but possibly also 3 times longer than you could do yourself.
Well, if that's the price for eloquence, I'm willing to pay it.
You're civil and marvellous, thank you. But it was a masterpiece of performance as well, as well writing, I think.
What I've noticed, if I can extrapolate on the basis of 2 examples, this and The Time Machine, is that because it is a performer-authored show, there is just a really tight bond between the performance details and the story itself. It does not feel, as is often the case, that there was a story and then some actors improvised a lot of stuff on top of the story. It really feels like it's designed from the get-go to take advantage of the 2 particular people performing the piece. And when that happens, you may limit a show to a particular set of performers, but what you get is a kind of idiomatic flow between all the details of the performance and what's going on story-wise. And it's a real joy because they are such polished comedians both in their own right, but also as they play off of one another.
They also know how to cast themselves in the right roles for themselves as well. I mean, Lawrence sings beautifully, and it is observed that Lindsay can sing but not so well, and I think she'd be the first to admit that, and therefore she is given the coarser role of Mr. Hyde in the performance piece, allegedly reluctantly at the beginning by Lawrence, but actually it's a perfect fit in that sense. But she's also got a slightly, he can play up to the intellectual but pompous performer, intellectual but pompous comedian. She plays up to the coarser, more raucous comedian. But they've cast themselves in the right roles for the piece. Or they're both brilliant in all things and they've just happened to have cast themselves that way. But I do very much like the fact that everything fits like a glove, which incidentally is what a glove puppet does at the beginning. But
this is a piece of which there's less to summarize. It's much more you have to go out and experience and have a great timepiece. But I continue to be
watch it, which is a timepiece.
Yes, puns on puns. We're so sorry, audience, but we're delirious with fatigue at this point. One thing I'll point out is that Lawrence has a lot of sheer talent. He can jump between different character types, and they all feel very well embodied, and they don't sound like the same voice, honestly. They're so distinct from each other. He can apparently play a mean guitar solo, and the piece overall, what I love is that it has the quality of being both highbrow and lowbrow at the same time.
Isn't that good? That really it shows their range as well as their writing. I think the point you've made there is actually very well illustrated by the first 2 songs as I remember them. The first song is a long expository song in the Gilbertian patter mould between the 2 sock puppets. So the 2 characters, 2 Victorian gentlemen in a drawing room eating their cake from Mrs. Twiglet, discussing what's gone wrong with Dr. Jekyll and how he's fallen in with this terrible, terrible Mr. Hyde, but who is Mr. Hyde? And it's done in this, as I say, in a Gilbertian patter song, which feels deeply appropriate for this sort of late Victorian telling of a strange case. And then the very next song is exhumed, I think, from Heidi Ho, and I think it's called Whoa, Whoa, Whoa. And it's a kind of high school American thing, and I'm doing the accent terribly, but he's a teacher in this American high school, and he does the kind of introductory song. Here are my mates on the faculty at the university, and we all fancy this teacher, to show you how sort of what a part of my language bastard version it is. That Dr. Frankenstein is there. He's one of the teachers as well, who, funny enough, will have a role to play at the very end of the piece when it is finally resolved. But those two songs come one after the other. There's a gap in between, but they are playing to very different kinds of strengths. And you do leap from 19th century music to what I would call late 20th century music. I'm using very broad brush terms here. But seamlessly, you get different characters. You get very British, you get very American, you get very reserved and downplayed, you get very over-the-top grotesques, all on the turn of a sixpence, it seems to me.
It is almost like a two-person variety show,
yes,
though very coherent and integrated at the same time.
There is a wealth of joy to be had from Jekyll Vs Hyde, but I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it is a show to be seen, or at least to be heard, because it is available on CD, by the way, and download. But our description can only be gushing in the end, because we both thought it was fantastic.
Agreed. If any of you listening have an opportunity to see this Edinburgh-wise or otherwise, we highly encourage it. It's just a blast.
It really is, and I want to see what they bring next time. Now, we were talking about the interesting format which is sort of built into the process of Jekyll Vs Hyde, the move from chamber musical to full-on rock musical, for want of a better phrase. There was another show which struck both of us profoundly on its choices of format, which was, I think, a mixed success. And that was the Grey Cat and the Flounder. And I should say anyone wishing to look it up online should remember that the spelling of grey is the American spelling of grey, because it's an American piece, so it's G-R-A-Y rather than G-R-E-Y.
The correct spelling, that is.
Oh, the Oxford English versus Webster, there's a battle in itself. But the reason we were both struck by it was because, as I say, the formatting, the way it was delivered to us, the audience, and the choices made on that. Then there's a different story to be told about the narrative, but actually that methodology was used to tell. And I think they're different stories. I'm leaving it to you, Mike, in a very selfish way, to explain what was so remarkable about the piece.
Sure, and as a framing comment, I agree that it was both striking and perhaps disappointing and frustrating at the same time. But I'll give a quick broad overview.
Please, yeah.
We're told at the outset that this is a bit of an epitaph based on, it's a tribute to a deceased academician, I believe at the University of Pittsburgh or thereabouts, and it was either commissioned by or inspired by her surviving husband, and it purports to tell, in retrospect, the relationship between the two of them as a loving farewell. So that's
after 46 years of marriage.
Yes, significantly so, and meant to convey some of the personality of the couple and their interests, and particularly the deceased wife, whose name, unfortunately, I don't remember off the cuff. What was very interesting about this to me is that, well, let me describe the experience of sitting down to see it. We are placed in a certain section of what looks like a modern, well-equipped academic lecture hall. There are headphones in front of each audience member, which we were told to wear. And it is explained to us that the musicians on stage are not only being amplified and sent straight to our headphones, but they are using a binaural microphone, which means one that emulates it's set up to deliver the experience of how do we describe this? To be compatible with human stereo hearing, to convey directly into our ears the spatial characteristics of sound. Finally, I arrived at a good description.
And it works as well, yes.
The idea is that if the musicians rotate around the microphone, I don't know if it's literally just a stereo mic or a stereo mic with additional spatial properties, but we have a very strong sense in our headphones of their spatial relationship to the field of sound.
That's exactly right. So if a flautist was playing whilst walking round the microphone, we, the audience, sitting in our seats with our headphones on, would also sense that flute music going round in the same sort of geographical configuration.
somebody smarter than I would be able to tell me if this is an example of what's called ambisonics, which is a very advanced way of representing space through audio, or something simpler. But in any case, there was a distinct sense of feeling the position of the players with respect to each other. And what is very unusual is, as Thos just said, the musicians would move and change position, and you'd get a very striking sense of their spatial relationship to you changing. And if a musician or perhaps a actor vocalized from far left, kind of 7 o'clock on the sound field, you really sense that they're right behind you whispering in your ear.
Yes.
And a little demo of this was provided at the outset. Music-wise, veering a little bit into content but steering clear of the narrative, which I'll leave to you, the music was really engaging. It was what I would call accessible, contemporary, perhaps academically styled music. And there's a little bit of atonality and perhaps like algorithmic music involved. But it was very emotional and expressive. Sometimes it felt like contemporary pop. Sometimes it felt like contemporary themed minimalism. Sometimes the music was very rhythmically driven. I believe the ensemble was a handful of strings, maybe not a full quartet, but maybe viola, violin, and cello. There were 1 or 2 woodwinds, at least a flute and clarinet.
There was a glockenspielist, wasn't there, as well?
There was a lot of mallet percussion. There was, I think, a bass marimba. It may have been your garden variety marimba, but I think it might have been a bass marimba. And someone in the back with just a lot of mallet percussion. So it was a very, what you call a colorful score in terms of having a lot of interesting timbres. And it was very expressive, employed sometimes as underscore, sometimes as song accompaniment, and sometimes mimetic vocal lines, where a vocalist would sing something and the instruments would match her pitch contour and rhythm precisely in a kind of back and forth, playful exchange. And combined with the binaural microphone effect and the fact that we are in the audience listening to headphones really provided something that was unique. It was halfway between a live performance and the experience of a studio album. And it is no small accomplishment to perfectly balance vocals and instrumentation, which is often a bugaboo of live music performance. I can't hear the singer, or the music's too quiet, or drowning the singer out. And here they, as a bonus of this setup, could master that issue and deliver everything almost as if it were an album.
In a minute, I'll get onto the narrative, and I will also get onto the some of the songs that could be extracted from it. One of which I think struck us both remarkably, which was essentially a academic paper being delivered set to music, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I just want to briefly talk about the success or otherwise of the headphone situation. Now, I agree with you, that orchestra and that score were remarkable. I would listen to that again tomorrow like a shot. I thought the choice of instrumentation was great, I thought the performances were great, and I very much liked the way the music was written. So it all slipped brilliantly into my ears in an interesting way. I have a slight problem, which is that my ears sit very firmly perpendicular to my head, and then if I have greased shoes and the wind's blowing in the right direction, I can turn round and round for about half an hour. So wearing headphones for any length of time is not a comfortable experience for me. And therefore, that's exactly what happened to me over the course of the hour of the show. I found after about 40 minutes my ears were hurting, not because of the music, because of the actual physicality of the headphones. So if this were to be replicated widely, I would find it disappointing. Conversely, it was absolutely wonderful to experience it, and I'm so glad that I did. And it was something you adored and I liked less, and you've touched upon it, which was that you love the fact you got the balance, you love the fact that you were getting it at the quality of a recording, but it was live. I accept all of those things, but I think there is a sense that you get a disconnect. One of the joys of live theatre for me is that sense of being in a room with everybody else, enjoying something with everyone else, and responding with, and at the same time, and in sympathy with everyone else. Or not enjoying it, depending on the piece, and the same is true for an orchestra as well, by the way. We respond to that music together. Now, the balance may be wrong. We've all been to shows where, exactly as you say, the music is too loud or the words are too loud or whatever it is. So the balance was lovely. But it was like sitting in the room with lots of people listening to an album, rather than sitting in the room with everyone enjoying the album at the same time. I felt that we'd been broken up into individual. It's like looking at a mosaic. Instead of seeing the bigger picture, each of us was an individual tesserae, one of the little stones. I enjoyed it, but I lost the sense of a communal feeling. And that is something I do value in theatre, in its broadest sense. So once again, I was so pleased to have done it. But if this were to become the norm for musical theatre, I would probably be less keen on going to see musical theatre. So that's just for me, it was a distancing thing rather than an engaging thing. But having done it and experienced it, I also want to say that if it were to happen occasionally, I'm always in. If it were to happen regularly, I wouldn't be in. I suppose that's where I am on that.
You've raised a really interesting point, and I think in retrospect, I agree. There was a kind of siloing of each audience member into our own private world. And although it afforded the show creators a lot of control of our individual experience, it really was an individual experience. There wasn't a sense of connection to the rest of the people in the room. So I think I'm inclined to agree with you now that I think about it.
I did actually take my headphones off for a couple of minutes, not just to rest my ears, but also to see what could be heard and experienced if you were listening to the show in a more traditional sense. And the answer is much less. So it was the only way really to appreciate the show. Everyone was mic'd, and so there was some kind of residual sense of music, but of course the whole thing hadn't been set up for the benefit of a performance in the room. It had been set up for the performance into cables and headphones, and therefore to take the headphones off really diminished from the experience. So it wasn't an either or, it was this or nothing.
They were relying upon the amplification and the miking. This technology, by the way, is used very advantageously in video games, which are typically individualistic experiences. And when they're collaborative, such as in the case of online games, you're still at home in your own private world,
of course, yeah,
venturing out into a shared world. So the headphones and the control of the sense of space and realism in that application is very important. Here, you're right, there is really a subtle cost.
But it was worth taking on this occasion, and within the context of what they were trying to do with it, I think they succeeded magnificently. However, that does lead me on to the area where I was slightly more disappointed, and I think we've alluded to the fact that, for me, the narrative failed. There was much good in the show. It's quite a bitty show in some senses. I mean, every now and then it would allow itself to go off on a flight of fantasy. So we had a little shadow play about a cat queen who is exiled from her kingdom because she can't dance properly, and then learns to dance through meeting a flounder, and then goes back to the kingdom, wins everybody over, and all is restored. It was enjoyable as a 5-minute vignette, I suppose, if a little bit whimsical. I don't have a problem with whimsy per se, but whimsy can cloy and become twee. And yet, other sketch moments, and I've got no other way of describing it, vignette might be a better way of describing it, was this song where we see the librarian character giving one of her talks on her proposed new method for classifying library books, which is a universal system. And what they very cleverly did there was take the text of her speech and then fractalize it, might be the worst way of describing it. So we got the sense of it, and then lines will be repeated, or extracts of lines will be repeated. It was exactly as you said earlier, it was underscored with the music in a way that reflected the conversational cadences, which is a remarkable thing to do. And the symbiosis there was just stunning in its own right. And it was like listening to a modern poem, because it was a found text in real terms, chopped up, represented, allowing you to get the sense, but also at the same time enjoy it on an abstract level, with a beautiful underscore which worked with it and underneath it, to make something truly amazing. That was the take-home thing from the show for me, was that piece of music, that setting, if you like, of the thesis, the speech that was given. I want to come back to the narrative in a minute, but that moment I think is worth discussing.
I loved that moment for all the reasons you stated. And it's also worth noting that moment is really detached from the overall narrative of the show. It's a little breakaway moment, I think you said, that can be enjoyed on its own right. It really felt like a minimalistic piece in the School of Music sense of minimalism, yes. not short. That could have been at home in a concert setting, in a contemporary concert setting. You could enjoy that as an entity in its own right without any kind of context or backdrop. And that quality, which made it portable out of the show and made it the breakaway hit, also, I think, indicates the limitations of the central story, because our favorite moment had nothing to do with the story, or was only...
And could be removed.
Could be removed, or could be isolated and made into its own thing.
If it was released on a CD, at least I would also know, having listened to it, how to classify it, which would also be useful. So it tidied itself up. But the narrative, and we can't escape this, at a human level, a very happy relationship, and they are very clearly devoted to each other and designed to be with each other, and that's wonderful, over a 46-year period, which is brought prematurely to an end because the woman dies in her 60s. So she's not young, but she's not old. So it is a premature ending, although they do have 46 marvellous years together, is not enough to fuel, I think, a narrative. Now, you don't need a linear narrative. You can do it piecemeal or in a collage, and I think that's what they were aiming at. But it was the pieces of the collage put together which failed to get across anything other than something that was ultimately distancing rather than engaging. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So we had the odd vignette. I think we need to clarify that the name of the show is The Grey Cat and the Flounder. It turns out that the husband in the relationship is also an artist. And he had apparently drawn, over the course of their relationship, cartoon representations of them doing whatever it is they had done in their day-to-day life. So she was the Grey Cat, he was the Flounder. The suggestion being that she stopped him floundering through their relationship, even though it was a cat and a fish, which you might not say in real life would necessarily go together, but there we are. And so we were treated to sub-animated projections representing some of the things that had happened. As I say, we also got this shadow puppet, sort of what I think of as an Arabian form of storytelling. Certainly, that's how I understand it historically. And if anyone's seen the silent film Prince Ahmed, or Ahmed, I think it is, 1920s film, it's that kind of thing. It's the black cutouts on sticks in front of a white screen, which in itself was perfectly charming, but then put with other vignettes. So we saw the couple in real life portrayed by two actors in their living room doing a jigsaw together and calling each other by their pet names, which I think we were supposed to find inspiring and jolly and charming and heartwarming. And ultimately, and I'm going to have to say this, and I think a lot of people felt this way, and I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but it came across as smug. It was, aren't we lucky? We've got everything. It's so warming. And you made an excellent observation that what it ultimately did was push us away rather than bring us in. And that is the really important thing about theatre. It must engage in some way, and this failed to engage because the story, through its vignettes, was ultimately introspective rather than... And there's no problem with introspection as long as you open a door for people to come in with you. And it didn't feel like that door had ever been opened. So we got... It was the jigsaw scene that really did it for me. But there was also the chap representing, the actor representing the husband would occasionally come on and read light verse about the cat and the flounder, which I think once again was supposed to be charming, but I must be honest, it was the doggerel end of verse, and had very little to say actually in its own right. It was really, look at this couple, they've done this slightly mundane thing in their domestic life, isn't that lovely?
It was very self-celebratory.
Yes. I mean, you're going to put this in a much better way than me, because I feel I've been quite judgmental and unpleasant there, but it is still a fundamental problem that it was smug and detached. But please do carry on.
I'm just going to paraphrase what you've said. It was like... There's a term that often comes up in musical theater, which is the unearned moment, where there's some kind of emotional celebration or some arrival point that doesn't feel substantiated based on what we have seen, such as the inevitable cheerful, rousing anthem at the end of a show when we don't quite feel like that level of happiness was deserved. In a very similar spirit, we are watching a lot of... I mean, this is an epitaph, so there's...
Yes.
Or eulogy? One of those two, perhaps both. And the nature of such presentations is saying nice things about the deceased. Of course, in the context of a family gathering or a gathering of friends...
Or a funeral oration.
Or a supernatural jury deliberation, as we talked about with respect to another show. There's a presumption that everybody understands the subject matter. If you're delivering a eulogy, everyone was close to the deceased. You are summoning up memories everyone has had, and that justifies all the praise that you are rightfully bestowing. When it's a case of an utter stranger, it feels like boasting, it feels like bragging, and it feels like a kind of trumping the audience, saying, we had this magical, wonderful, whimsical world. We're going to give you little glimpses of it, and we're going to spend a lot of time telling you why it was so great. but there was nothing we actually see that substantiates that level of praise. As human beings, if you were to tell us the story in real life outside of the context of a musical, we'd say, that sounds heartbreaking. She sounded like a really interesting woman. I'm so sorry for you. But a musical has different responsibilities. It has to show us something that we can understand and appreciate. We need to see more than an exchange of cutesy nicknames. We really have to have a sense, oh, this woman is really special. Show us, dramatize a moment. And that never happens. So we end up resenting what is very well intended.
Oh, yes, I agree
very
with that.
Tender, very sincere words of kindness about a departed person. But because it's delivered to us in a just trust us, she was amazing kind of format, we resent it, and it does not land at all dramatically. And speaking firsthand, by the end of the show, I just wanted to get out of there. I was seeing scenes that in real life would have been heartbreaking, but in the context of a musical, were just eye-rollingly patience-trying.
You see, I think you've drawn something amazing out of that, which I hadn't ever stopped to think about, but you're exactly right. Usually, there's often a question, isn't there? Why have you turned this particular story, and I'm talking in a generalist term here, into a musical? Sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not, but usually there's some reason why using a musical format, in whatever kind of musical format you want to use, is a really successful, or at least potentially successful way of telling a story, concertinaing time, expressing emotion, whatever the things that the musicalization does that you can't always easily do with a standard dramatization or even just a storytelling recitation. There's normally some kind of way you can do it, and I have heard it argued that there is no piece of drama that you can't effectively musicalize. Whether that's true or not is a discussion for another day, but I've heard it argued. This is the proof that that isn't true, because actually, exactly as you said, if someone had been telling us this story, we would have been able to connect with it, condole, sense the humanity, have the humane feeling that we as fellow humans would have about a life cut short. The musicalization of this is to recontextualize it wrongly, and I think that's a bold statement, but I have to say it's true. That it proves that there can be stories that if you musicalize them, it is the wrong thing to do, and therefore not everything can or should be musicalized. This has gotten to a slightly bigger story, and you may disagree with me as well. You may just say, well, actually there was a way of doing this story musically which would have been successful, and I'm sure actually that must be true. It's not easy to see how, given the materials that we were offered.
Well, every romantic comedy tells us the story, musical or otherwise, tells us the story about two people who may not be striking in any sort of way, but that gives us a flavor of their personalities and their life, and above all gives us details and shows us those interactions. And through dramatizing the relationship, we can connect. We can say, oh, that was a meet cute. I met my girlfriend or wife or significant other that way. I get it. That was a funny joke. I like this guy. He's funny. He's winning over the initially reluctant partner by force of will and charm and a little bit of panache. The key to the success of those shows is giving us the details and bringing us into the specifics of the relationship, not narrating about it after the fact. So I think it's very possible to sell us on a story like this and make us emote with it, but it can't be done in, I haven't decided if it's a eulogy or epitaph. I promise after the show I'll refresh myself on the definitions of those terms, but it can't be done in this kind of post facto assertional way. It really has to be an offering to us in a way that the show is not. But I think it is an accomplishable goal.
I think actually now I'm revising my view. I think you're right, there must be a way of doing it, and it is to overtly ask the question to your audience, do you agree and can you see? Ask them a question, ask them to engage. It's a form of engagement. We're presenting you this, can you see it? Rather than we're presenting you this for you to agree with. I'm not sure I've differentiated that very well, but I think if you ask the question overtly at the beginning and then show the illustrating points, for better or for worse as well. I mean, why would you have anything negative in it? But there was nothing negative in it. But by extension, not having anything negative in it paints someone as one-dimensional.
It's an excellent point that there wasn't really any conflict.
Or even grit.
That's true, except the tragedy of the ending, which is told to us from the start.
Yeah.
So that's also a very interesting point. So I think the subject matter is good. The music was extraordinary.
Oh, yes.
The presentation of the music was very interesting and innovative, but there was a lack of musical storytelling, or indeed any kind of storytelling here, and that's where it fell flat for us both emotionally.
I agree with you absolutely on that. So much good in this, and yet not quite there. However, I would be very interested to see other musicals which wish to push the envelope of formatting in this way, or anything written by the same composer.
I agree. I was just impressed by that element, and I would argue it's worth attending the show, flaws and all, just to appreciate the score.
Oh, yes. I wouldn't say don't go and see this. I would say definitely go and see it, but just be aware that your attention probably needs to be focused on some elements rather than others.
Indeed.
So, well, Mike, we've only really had a chance to talk about 2 shows today, 2 very, very differing shows, although both about relationships and couples, both very different in their approaches to them. But speaking as one of 2 people talking about these shows of couples, I would also like to say, Mike, thank you so much for your insights, which bring light to where I can only provide darkness. So thank you.
Well, you're too self-disclaiming as always, but I've enjoyed the chat. And for the audience, to give you a little bit of a takeaway, if you think of the dramatic contrast between these 2 shows, this speaks to the diversity of offerings at the Edinburgh Fringe, and I think continues to sell the Fringe as an experience worth attending by anyone who loves musical theatre or even theatre generally.
Oh, I agree. It's absolutely the place to go. It's not the world's biggest arts festival for nothing, and long may it bring us the experimental stuff, or the unusual stuff, or the stuff you just don't get to see anywhere else, not just at the Edinburgh Fringe, but other fringes too. It's so good that there is at least a place for the 1-hour musical that says, right, I'm going to do this backwards, or I'm going to take this from a totally different approach, or what I'm doing is relentlessly uncommercial and therefore has no option anywhere else, but you can see them at the fringes.
And whether you liked something or hated it, it probably lasted an hour, and you probably spent £12 on it. So to have that kind of experience with such a low overhead and cost is an additional virtue of the whole experience.
It certainly is. Well, Mike, thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you again about, well, future Edinburgh shows, but also future shows by the up-and-coming composer Michael G. Shapiro.
He is one of my favorites.
Yes, it's funny enough, he's one of my favourites.
Oh, shucks. Till then.
Musical talk. And there we are, Michael Gordon Shapiro and I talking about The Grey Cat and the Flounder and Jekyll Vs Hyde. Now, if you want to find out more about Jekyll vs Hyde, or indeed the wider works of Lawrence Owen and Lindsay Sharman, you can. Go along to their website, lolsproductions.co.uk. So that's LOLS Productions. And as they said themselves, it's not just laughing out loud, it's also their initials. They also are responsible for 2 podcasts, which may be of interest to you. One is called Adults Do Disney, and it is genuinely fanboy and fangirl discussing Disney and all the works that go with it, but also Mockery Manor, their new mystery thriller drama series, which has been getting tremendously good reviews. So remember, go along to lolsproductions.co.uk to find out more about that. There's also a chance to get the album for Jekyll vs Hyde, and of course the other musicals that Lawrence and Lindsay have been responsible for. The Time Machine, Cine Musicals and Cine Musicals High. And if you want to find out more about The Grey Cat and the Flounder, you can do that too. The best places to find out more are the Pittsburgh New Music Ensemble website, which is pnme.org, and also wearecivilddisobedience.com, which also has some information on that musical. Well, as we've established in the conversation, Jekyll vs Hyde was all about dichotomy. And so has this episode been, because Jekyll vs Hyde and The Grey Cat and the Flounder, whilst both shows which are ostensibly about 2 different personalities, either getting on or not getting on, the shows themselves could not have been more different in their approach and in their style. But both fit very squarely into the world of musical theatre. It is an enormous spectrum. And remember, if you don't like one, there'll be another one coming along in a minute that you might. The same can be said of musical talk. If you didn't like today's episode, well, first of all, shame on you, but if you didn't, and it's perfectly possible, then hopefully you'll enjoy next week's instead. So do come back and listen to that. And if those aren't winding up words, by which I mean coming to the end of an episode rather than trying to irritate you, then I don't know what are. And as I do know what are, I'm going to close this episode. And I'm going to do so with that word that I love so much to say, and you love even more to hear. Certainly from me. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Michael Gordon Shapiro. Copyright Musical Talk 2020, except for the songs where the copyright remains with Lawrence Owen and Lindsay Sharman. And my enormous thanks to them for allowing me to play their songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.
But what you get is a kind of idiosyncrasy? No, that's not the word I'm looking. Idiomatic? What you get is a kind of idiomatic flow between all the details of the performance and what's going on story-wise. I trust you're going to edit that.
Oh, yes, don't worry.
Thank you so much.